Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to a new online event that I'm co-presenting with Dr. Owen Emerson in March 2025. It's called The Making of a Queen, Anne Boleyn 1501 to 1522. Through a series of 6 pre-recorded lectures and 1 live Zoom discussion, we'll explore the transformative experiences and interactions that shaped the woman and Queen Anne would become. Participants will also be entered into a very special giveaway and have access to all recordings for 2 months after the event ends. This would make the perfect Christmas gift for a Boleyn or Tudor history lover, and I do hope you'll consider joining us. For details, head to my website on thetudortrail.com or just Google The Making of a Queen Eventbrite. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome Professor Diane Watt to the show to chat about the life and correspondence of Margaret Paston. Diane is the author of God's Own Gentlewoman, The Life of Margaret Paston, published by Icon in 2024. She's a world-leading expert on women's writing in medieval England and has published many academic books on this topic. She's currently professor at the University of Surrey and has also taught at Aberystwyth University and the University of Oxford. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Diane. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yes, I'm looking forward to our conversation. So perhaps we can just begin by you just introducing yourself to our listeners and just telling us a little bit about you and your background.
So I'm a writer and academic. I'm Professor of Medieval English Literature at the University of Surrey in England. My expertise is in medieval literature and specifically medieval women's writing. And I'm a Margaret Paston fangirl.
You are a Margaret Paston fangirl, and we are here, in fact, to talk about your book, God's Own Gentlewoman, The Life of Margaret Paston. So tell us a little bit about when you first became interested in her life and whether there was anything in particular that inspired that interest.
Yes, I first became interested in Margaret Paston when I was studying for my MA in medieval studies at the University of Bristol. I'd studied literature, history and archaeology as an undergraduate in Glasgow. And at the time, back in the 1980s, early 1980s, I was really struck by the kind of absence of women from the curriculum across those sort of disciplines, especially in relation to medieval studies. So when I went to Bristol, I was introduced to the Paston Letters by a wonderful scholar called Basil Cottle. And Basil, he was the author of the Penguin History of Surnames, and he was very much kind of a polymath. He just knew absolutely everything. And he made our year at Bristol just hugely enjoyable. He took us on lots of trips to places like Dorchester Abbey. He took us to the Ridgeway. He took us to Cardiff Castle. Made me really understand the importance of sort of visiting site visits in scholarship. But yeah, he introduced me to the Paston Letters, and specifically the letters of Margaret Paston. And he's very interested in heraldry, and so he hand painted me a Paston coat of arms, which I have to this day. So he was very much inspired by Basil and his introduction, and really from there, I was just fascinated to be able to find out so much about an actual woman's life. A wealthy woman, but a woman who was not sort of devoted to the church, or but was living within the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And just in case our listeners haven't actually heard about the Paston Letters before, can you just kind of introduce us to this collection of correspondence?
Absolutely. So the Paston Letters is a collection of correspondence from 15th century. There was also some later correspondences as well, but the medieval Paston Letters date to the 15th century, and they basically cover 3 generations of a family. So Margaret Paston, her parents-in-law, her and her children. That's the main part of the collection. And so this is a really important collection of personal correspondence because it's the largest that we have, and it contains a lot of information, including about the Wars of the Roses, because some of the in the second half of the 15th century actually report on some of those events. And within this collection, we have over 100 letters by Margaret Paston herself, as well as letters to Margaret. So it's a fantastic resource, really, for understanding the life of the gentry classes at this period in history.
What an incredible collection. And to have so many letters by one woman, I think is absolutely fascinating. So tell us a little bit about what insights Margaret's letters offer into the practice of letter writing at the time, especially when we're talking about women correspondence.
So one thing that's particularly remarkable about these letters is it seems pretty clear that Margaret was unable to write, that she relied on scribes to write her letters for her. And that was not uncommon in the time, as being a scribe could be quite a menial activity in many ways. People relied on secretaries and scribes, even if they were able to write. But it seems pretty clear that Margaret couldn't write. She may or may not have been able to read. We don't know that for certain. And the two didn't necessarily come hand in hand. Sometimes people had some literacy, but not full literacy. And so Margaret relied on scribes, particularly her sons and family servants, to write her letters for her. And one of the implications of this is that I suppose letters were not private in quite the way that we would think of them today. Obviously, you get business letters today and you get private correspondence, and we tend to think of a sort of quite firm separation between the two categories. But there wasn't that firm separation. So even relatively intimate and private letters would often be dictated to scribe. So a very famous example of this is a letter by Margaret's future daughter-in-law, Marjorie Bruce. Marjorie Bruce wrote 2 Valentine letters to her future husband at a time when the negotiations for the marriage were taking place. And these letters, one of them contains some lines of verse that Marjorie seems to have written herself. They're both really quite intimate letters, and yet they're written in the handwriting of a servant of the family. So again, I think that these letters are certainly by Marjorie, but we do know that the scribes might have some sort of input into these letters. So yeah, I think that illustrates quite clearly how modern ideas of sort of the personal correspondence or privacy are not so relevant in this period of history in relation to letter writing. But yeah, so Margaret relied on scribes, but she must have actually really enjoyed writing letters for so many letters to have survived, because I think we can assume that this is only a fraction of her actual correspondence, that we haven't got the full collection. And I think that it's pretty clear that Margaret must have spent large parts of her day on her correspondence and having her correspondence, either reading it herself or having it read to her. And sometimes she writes 2 or 3 long letters in the same day. So that must have been like the full day must have been devoted to her correspondence.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I know when I read your book, and by the way, I absolutely loved it. I think I devoured it in 2 sittings. It was so interesting. I was thinking about exactly that, how much time must have been devoted to this practice of letter writing, receiving the letters, dictating if she's not writing them herself. Just a huge amount of time, really. So fascinating. So, Diane, tell us a little bit about what we know of Margaret's family and her early life.
So Margaret was from a wealthy family. And so she was born into a well-to-do Norfolk family. Her father died when she was a child. She was must have been his only child because she was his principal heir. So when she married into the Paston family, she brought a considerable amount of wealth into the family. And so her father died when she was probably just below the age at which children could first be married off, which was the age of 12. I think she was about 10 or 11 when her father died. But she's continued to live with her mother, who ultimately remarried with her stepfather, I think, for the next few years. Having said that, I don't think we're not absolutely sure about what happened in her life, because we just don't have any real details of her life until the correspondence about her and her own correspondence starts, which is at the point where she marries into the Paston family. So the first record that we really have about her is a letter that her mother-in-law writes to her future mother-in-law writes to her future father-in-law, describing the first meeting between John and Margaret. So this was obviously an arranged marriage, and the decision had been made that if the couple were willing, that they would marry. And so Agnes, Margaret's mother-in-law, organizes this initial meeting and then writes to her husband to report on how successful it's been.
And so tell us a little bit more about her relationship with her husband that you just mentioned, and the in-laws as well. What was that like?
So that's really interesting, because although this clearly was an arranged marriage, and it doesn't appear, from the evidence we have, it doesn't appear that the couple had met before the decision that before the arrangements for the marriage had started, at least the initial negotiations had started. Nevertheless, it seems pretty clear that they really loved each other. Margaret and her husband were very close from very early on in the marriage. The letters between them, especially some of the early letters from Margaret, when, for example, she was expecting her eldest children, some of these are really quite intimate. Very sort of, there's a real sense of her affection. So there's one letter, for example, where she refers quite cryptically to her pregnancy. And she alludes to having given her husband a ring of St. Margaret. And St. Margaret was the patron saint of childbirth. So this ring is a sort of token of the pregnancy. And she's talking about the fact that people are starting to notice that she's pregnant, that she's going to have to basically make it public that she's expecting. But she's obviously very excited about this. And so she writes this very sort of affectionate letter to her husband, quite playful letter, which does, as I say, indicate, I think, there's a real closeness there. And she actually makes a joke at the end saying that she's sending him this ring, and in return he has given her a gift which makes her remember him both night and day, and that gift is her referring to the pregnancy. So she can't sleep because she's pregnant. But this is a positive thing. This is an exciting thing for her. And this kind of closeness continues right up to John's death. So John, unfortunately, found himself imprisoned in the Fleet Prison in London on a number of occasions as the family got involved in various property disputes. And on one occasion, Margaret's so worried about him that she travels from Norfolk to London to visit him. And this is the only time that we know that Margaret left Norfolk. So this is quite significant. A journey from Norwich to London may not seem that significant today, but in this time, this was a significant journey for her to be making. And probably, this was almost the equivalent of Margaret traveling around the world, to go and see her husband. So that was really significant. And in terms of her relations with her in-laws, I think she got sometimes quite frustrated with her father-in-law. I mean, early on, she refers to her father-in-law sort of failing to do chores that she's asked, fetching her things, buying her things that she's asked, pushing the blame on her husband. But basically, she is aware that he's just forgotten or just couldn't be bothered. So there's a bit of frustration there. But she was very close to her mother-in-law, Agnes, because actually the age gap between them wasn't that great. So when Margaret was pregnant with her first child, Agnes was also pregnant. The two women were pregnant at the same time. So Agnes was pregnant with one of Margaret's husband's younger siblings. And, I think Agnes played an important role in helping Margaret in the early stages of her marriage, getting to grips with everything that was involved in married life, everything that was involved in running a household, the sort of politics as well as the sort of practicalities. So Agnes and Margaret really were very firm friends.
So tell us a little bit about what those household duties were. What do the letters tell us about Margaret's kind of daily life? We know she's doing a lot of letter writing. What else is she doing?
Yeah, so she's obviously bringing up the children. So she has 7 surviving children. There may have been more that died in childbirth. We don't know for certain. She also had to obviously manage the household, manage the servants. She would have taken responsibility for overseeing the purchasing of provisions, for the education of the children, at least in their early years. And she even would have taken responsibility for their medical care, sort of acting almost as if both a GP and a pharmacist. So she would give advice on medical care, and she would actually make up recipes herself for herbal medicines from plants in her garden, or she would send off for medicines from the apothecaries in London if they were medicines that she wasn't able to make herself. So she was doing these sorts of household tasks, but she was also because the family that she married into and was a very upwardly mobile family. The Pastons were purchasing a large number of properties. They had multiple estates. But her husband John was a lawyer, as his father-in-law had been. John spent a lot of time in London. And so Margaret found herself effectively managing the estates, looking after the tenants, collecting the rent, even running the manorial courts, so overseeing the local justice system. So these were some significant responsibilities. And as a consequence, because she found herself in this position of looking after the estates, when enemies of the family decided that they wanted to lay claim to some of the Paston properties, which seemed to happen with a somewhat surprising regularity, Margaret found herself actually having to physically defend these properties from attack. So she was really had very significant responsibilities. And in one case, the original home of Margaret and John in Gresham, this was besieged by some enemies while she was within it. And the enemies broke down the walls, broke down the doors, and forcibly carried her out of the manor house. So she was really finding herself in some very difficult situations. So you can imagine from all of this then, she was an incredibly busy woman. So we don't know how she spent much of her leisure time. Obviously, as you mentioned, she spent a lot of time writing letters. She also would have spent a lot of time going to church services. That would have been a regular feature of her day, of her week. We know that she did sometimes dine with some of her neighbours, and she entertained at home. We also know from one of her letters where she's describing the celebrations at Christmas that the family, you would probably play things like board games. They'd play cards. In fact, very interestingly, one of the earliest reference we have to playing cards in Britain appears in one of Margaret's letters. So, there would be board games, chess, as a version of backgammon, playing cards. And members of the family also engaged in sport, for example, hawking. That's a very popular sport. And that was a sport that was available to women. So although Margaret does refer to hawking in her letters, she doesn't refer to going hawking herself. But nevertheless, I think we could extrapolate that that's a possibility that that's something that she would have done.
Yeah, amazing. What a wealth of information these letters offer. It's incredible. And so you've already talked about the fact that, of course, Margaret's living at a time that we might now refer to as the Wars of the Roses. And in 1453, she meets Queen Margaret of Anjou. How did this meeting come about, and what happened during the meeting?
So this was clearly a much anticipated event for Margaret. So for some time leading up to Margaret of Anjou's visit to Norwich. So Margaret and her husband their main residence was in Norwich by this stage. In the time leading up to it, Margaret writes to her husband trying to get him to buy her some new jewellery, which he fails to do. And it becomes apparent that she wanted this jewellery specifically for the visit of Margaret of Anjou. So Margaret of Anjou was coming to Norwich. She was traveling to Norwich en route to Walsingham. Margaret was, of course, the wife of Henry VI. At this point, she was pregnant for the first time. So this was a really much anticipated, important event. And so she was traveling to Walsingham, which was the famous shrine, in order to give thanks to God for her pregnancy and to sort of pray for a safe pregnancy. And so she traveled through Norwich on that journey and stayed there. And so Margaret had the opportunity to meet Margaret of Anjou, and she attended that meeting with her friend Elizabeth Clear, who was a very wealthy widow. And Margaret writes to her husband and complains that she didn't have any suitable jewelry because he'd failed to buy her an appropriate necklace. She didn't have any suitable jewelry to wear for this meeting, and so she'd had to borrow some from Elizabeth Clear. So there's a strong element of reproach here that she's had to borrow this necklace. But then in the letter where she describes this meeting with Margaret of Anjou, Margaret of Anjou seems to have been much more interested in Elizabeth Clear than she was in Margaret, and discussed with Elizabeth whether Elizabeth would remarry. And the reason for this is that Elizabeth Clear was a widow. She was very wealthy and would have made a good match for someone that Margaret of Anjou's court. But it becomes apparent that Elizabeth Clear had no intention of following Margaret of Anjou's advice. She wasn't going to get married. And in fact, she didn't. She continued to enjoy her wealthy widowhood for the rest of her life.
And so this obviously is a period of great turmoil, lots of changes. So what other events does Margaret witness in her life?
So as we said, the Wars of the Roses sort of are going on around her in the period from 1455 onwards. Her family itself are sort of involved. They sort of shift allegiances from the Lancastrians to the Yorkists and back again, depending on the way that the wind is blowing, as it were. Her sons are involved in various battles. And one of her sons actually receives a knighthood for his role in supporting Henry VII. But I think from Margaret's perspective, what she was really seeing was the sort of chaos that was taking place in the localities. The effect of civil war is, of course, we know about some major battles in the civil wars, but the effect of civil war was to enable quite riotous behaviour in the localities, and this is something that the Margaret saw firsthand. And in fact, and as I say, suffered from, because people would take advantage of the civil war to try and lay claim to the Paston properties. Margaret would find herself having to defend them or to advise her sons on their defence. But the other sorts of events are running alongside this are, of course, the series of outbreaks of plague that took place throughout the 15th century. There were waves of epidemics of bubonic and pneumonic plague, and also other diseases like sweating sickness, for example. And in fact, in one year, 1479, 3 members of Margaret Paston's family died, which, we don't know if they all died of plague, but it's certainly possible. So a number of the letters do talk about the spread of plague, the need to obtain medicines, the need to isolate. There's a letter by one of her sons where he describes the family not being able to leave the house in Norwich, having to stay within the house. I mean, it all seems very familiar now after our experiences of COVID, of course. But so these sorts of concerns about illness and death were very real at this point. And Margaret's medical knowledge was certainly she had to draw on her medical knowledge a lot in this period. Yeah,
she certainly did face many challenges. So you alluded earlier to the fact that there were quite a few property disputes with other families, other local families. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of those challenges that she faced?
Yeah, so as I say, there were some numerous property disputes. There was the attack on Gresham. Later on, the family controversially inherited the estate of Sir John Fastolf, who was a distant relative of Margaret's, and that included Caister Castle. And Caister Castle was actually besieged at one stage, and Margaret was writing to her sons, advising them. She's trying to convince her older son, her younger son, her second son, was leading the defence, and he was trapped, besieged inside Caister Castle. And she was advising her older son to try and negotiate some sort of truce so that her second son could escape. But as well as these sort of attacks on property, there were also challenges closer to home. So Margaret, in particular, there were a number of crises surrounding the marriage of the potential marriages of her children. One of them, for example, one famous example is her elder daughter, Marjorie, made the decision to elope and marry the family bailiff, Richard's Call. Margaret was really horrified by this. She felt that Marjorie and Richard Call had betrayed her. Marjorie was marrying beneath her. And so Margaret tried to have the marriage annulled, and she went to see the Bishop of Norwich, accompanied by her good friend Agnes, her mother-in-law. The two women went to see the Bishop of Norwich, and Margaret tried to convince them the bishop that this marriage hadn't taken place. And the bishop was very sympathetic, but he said, well, I'm going to have to interview the couple and find out what happened. And he had to come back to Margaret and say, I'm sorry, but actually this is a valid marriage. So Margaret didn't get her way on that occasion. But then her second daughter also seemed to fall in love with a family servant. And on that occasion, the family sort of stepped in at a much earlier stage and just made sure that wasn't going to happen and made alternative arrangements. And so that crisis was avoided. But yeah, so family crises. And then, of course, there was the premature death of her husband. Margaret's husband died in London, somewhat unexpectedly. And what's particularly telling there is that there's actually a gap in Margaret's correspondence after his death. So I don't know if perhaps she's just stopped writing letters. Maybe the letters weren't kept. It's not entirely clear what happened there, but certainly I think that silence of several months after the death of her husband is really telling. I think that the loss of her husband was a real shock to her, and she had to take time to adapt to the change in her circumstances as well as the grief that she was experiencing.
Yeah, that would make sense, especially given what you said about the sort of intimacy in the letter writing between them. So you talked earlier about Elizabeth Clare and obviously her relationship and friendship with her mother-in-law, Agnes, as well. Do Margaret's letters provide any insights into other relationships or friendships with women?
I should say her closeness to Agnes and also her friendship with Elizabeth Clare are really well testified to. I mean, the friendship with Elizabeth Clare is particularly interesting because the two women there was a strong sense of mutual support between the two women and their families. So Margaret's husband would give Elizabeth Clare legal advice, and interestingly, Elizabeth Clare would lend money to the family. Because this is a time before the invention of the bank as we know it. So you couldn't, if you wanted to borrow money, in a sense, yes, you might go to a money lender, but often you would borrow it from members of your family. And perhaps that's still the case today, even with banks. But certainly Elizabeth Clare would lend Margaret and her family money because she, as I mentioned, she was very wealthy. But we also have a friendship between Margaret and another woman who was less exalted than Elizabeth Clare, a woman called Alice Crane, and we have a small number of letters between Margaret and Alice, and you get a sense of a really supportive friendship there. And also, interestingly, they exchange recipes for medicines. So they exchange medicines. So they're obviously offering that sort of practical support as well. And then there were other sort of members of the extended family that Margaret seems to have been close to. I think that she got on very well with Marjorie Bruce, who became her daughter-in-law, and also Marjorie Bruce's mother, Dame Elizabeth Bruce. So there were a number of female friendships testified to in these letters. And that in itself is really interesting because we don't have that much evidence in the later Middle Ages of women's friendship. It's just something that isn't recorded, perhaps not seen as significant enough to be recorded. So to have these sorts of insights into the sorts of friendships that existed, I think is really interesting.
Absolutely. And so you've obviously spent a lot of time immersed in the life of Margaret Paston. So sum up for us the character of the woman that you came to know through your research.
So I think Margaret was an incredibly competent woman. She was, as I've said, she was managing property. She was managing a household. She was managing a family. She'd have been a fantastic businesswoman, I think, in today's world. She was also a woman who was incredibly loyal to her husband and to her sons, and I think to her female friends. But there were double standards at work. She wasn't so patient with her daughters. She never really forgave her daughter Marjorie for marrying a family servant against her will. So I think that Margaret's a figure that I admire, but I'm not sure that I would necessarily have liked her if I'd known her.
Yeah, I think that happens quite a lot with people from history that we study. So interesting. And so the last thing that we do on Talking Tudors, Diane, is what I like to call a game of 10 to go. So these are just 10 quick questions just to get to know you a little bit better. And one thing that I really loved about your book is how you, of course, weaved in visits to historic sites, and you talked about the power of visiting places. So what's one of your favorite historic sites to visit?
I really enjoyed visiting Norwich and locating the various places that Margaret mentions in her letters. So one thing that struck me was, so Margaret and her husband lived in Elm Hill, which is a beautiful street in Norwich, which is often used for film sets today. It's a beautiful cobbled street with jetted houses. So that's the houses, the wood-framed houses with the overhangs. And there's a house in that street which has got a plaque on that says it's the Paston house. It probably isn't actually. There was a fire, and this house is probably that burned down the houses in the street. This house is probably a century or two later, but nevertheless, it's still very atmospheric. And then from there, you can walk to the former church that Margaret and her family worshipped at, St. Peter Hungate, which is now an art centre. It was decommissioned in the early 20th century. But that church has two corbels of carved corbels, one of which is believed to be a representation of Margaret Paston and one a representation of her husband, because they paid for some restoration work on that church. And then from there, you can walk to the St. Andrew's Hall, which is part of the Halls complex, which is former Dominican friary complex. Again, the family paid for some restoration work there. And there's still a door there that has the arms of Paston and Maltby arms being Margaret's birth family, again, celebrating the generosity of the Pastons in paying for restorations. And what really struck me about walking around that area is just how close an area it is. You really get a sense still as you walk around it of that area as it would have been in Margaret's lifetime. So it's really quite intimate insight into that area.
Let's talk about books. I love books. So what was the last book that you read, or perhaps one that you're currently reading at the moment?
The book that I'm currently reading is Dorothy L. Sayers' Strong Poison. I've just started it. I've never read Strong Poison before. I read Gaudy Night and really loved Gaudy Night. And Strong Poison is the earlier book in the series. The first of the books involves Peter Wimsey investigating the arrest of Harriet Vane, who becomes a sort of central figure in Gaudy Night. So, yes, I'm returning to detective fiction at the moment.
And obviously you spend a lot of time writing and researching. Do you have any particular writing rituals that you like to follow when you're working?
So for me, writing is usually it's something that I have to do first thing in the morning. So I like to get up, have my breakfast, and then sit down at the desk and write for a few hours, and then stop round about lunchtime and maybe do some reading or other work in the afternoon. But the key thing for me is to do the writing first thing in the morning when my brain's absolutely fresh. I'm not a late night person for writing. I like to feel that I'm completely on the ball when I sit down.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. And what about a new skill that you'd like to learn?
I've got this ambition that I'd like to learn to fly.
Oh.
I don't know whether I'll ever do that, but my father used to work for British Airways, spent a lot of time as a child in airports. My father's idea of childcare, this was in the days before health and safety, would be to take my brother and I to his workplace, which was the airport, and we'd be running around near the runways. And so I've got a sort of fondness for airports. I feel quite at home in them. And I quite like the idea of learning to fly a small plane just for the fun of it, really.
Yeah, I think in all the interviews I've done, Diane, no one's ever said flying. So good on you, because I've done about 270 episodes. And so if you're you're about to sit down to work, but you're not feeling very inspired, how do you get yourself into that creative mode or find inspiration?
So one tip that I read or heard many years ago, I don't know where it came from, but was that when you finish writing, finish halfway through a point that or something that you already know where it's going next. So that when you sit down the next day, you're not sitting down to a blank page. You're sitting down to an idea that you already know how you're going to progress. I find that really helpful, actually. So I might take some note as I'm finishing my work about what I'm going to do next. But then it's a case of writing those notes up the next morning. And that sort of eases me in. I mean, occasionally I just do sit down and I just can't really make much progress. But I do try and make sure I set myself a sort of goal, kind of limited goal of some minimum number of words that I want to write that day. And I try and make sure that I achieve that goal. Even if I don't think the words are very good, it's always easy to come back and edit them.
Yeah, they're really good tips. Thank you for sharing. And what about a travel destination, somewhere you'd like to visit, perhaps that you haven't yet been to?
I'd really like to visit Central and South America, where I've never been. And in fact, it's a bit of a sad story here, because my wife and I got married 6 years ago, and we planned our honeymoon to Central America. And just shortly before we were due to leave, my mother got very ill, and we had to cancel it. So we postponed it, and we booked it for the following year. And the following year, just before we left, COVID outbreak happened. And so then it had to be cancelled by the travel company because we weren't allowed to travel. So that honeymoon has never happened. And we have never made it to Central America. So that's somewhere I would like to, perhaps third time lucky.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hope you get there. What about an ideal Sunday morning? What does that consist of for you?
So an ideal Sunday morning is leisurely breakfast and then a long dog walk. So we have 3 dogs. The dogs, you will have encountered the dogs in my book about Margaret Paston, because we take the dogs when we visit the various sites associated with Margaret's life. And yeah, so it'll be a long dog walk in the countryside and then coming back to a Sunday roast.
Yeah, that sounds marvelous. And have you always wanted to be an historian, academic, writer, or did you have other dreams when you were a child?
So I think quite a young age, I initially wanted to be an archaeologist. And so that's what when I started studying at university. I started with archaeology, but I'd been interested in literature and history when I was at school. And so in the Scottish university system, you don't specialize until the end of your second year. So you do 2 sort of more general years. So I was studying archaeology alongside literature and history. And I was interested in all 3 subjects. But ultimately, I started to focus on literature, really when I started reading medieval literature, because I became aware of, I hadn't studied any medieval literature when I was at school. And so I realized that actually that reading literary texts gave me the sort of insights into sort of personal lives of people that I didn't get when I was studying history or archaeology. And so that's what sort of led me down this pathway. But yeah, really, I've always been interested in the past, and particularly the Middle Ages, really from my childhood.
And last question for you. What do you like to do to relax and unwind?
I think I'm going to be very boring with this. I probably would say I like to sit down and read a book. I like to go for a walk, or I like to go and, I enjoy going and visiting gardens. We're very lucky here in Surrey. There are a lot of gardens to visit. The Royal Horticultural Society's big base in Wisley is fairly nearby, which is just a stunning place to visit if you like gardens, if you like flowers. So as I've got older, visiting gardens is a real pleasure for me.
Yeah, that does sound really relaxing. And the very final thing is our Tudor takeaway. And this time it can be a 15th century takeaway if you like. So something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. So do you have a takeaway for us?
I do. And my takeaway is going to be the Medieval Women in Their Own Words exhibition at the British Library, which is currently on until March of next year. So even people in Australia can, if you fancy coming over, could come. That gives you time to book a flight and make it over here to visit it. It's just a fabulous exhibition. It obviously focuses on the British Library's own holdings. So it's got things like the Book of Marjorie Kemp, the Revelations of Julian of Norwich, which are both early works by women written in English. But it also has sort of historical materials, and it has some artifacts. For example, there's a display around Margaret of Anjou, and that includes a skull of a lion that Margaret of Anjou apparently kept as a pet. And there was also a hoard of coins that was thought to have been hidden away, that was rediscovered, but thought to have been hidden away by Margaret of Anjou's supporters. These coins were to help finance her battle. So there's definitely some Wars of the Roses interest in this exhibition as well.
Yeah, it looks absolutely amazing. I actually just purchased the accompanying publication that goes with it, just because I don't think I'll be able to get over in time, but it's stunning. It's got the most beautiful images and a wealth of information about medieval women and their lives. So what a great takeaway. Thank you. And Diane, thank you so much for taking the time to come on to the podcast to talk with us today.
No problem at all. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.